The restriction list. Bandai notified players that in 4 days, there'd be a new restriction list. Tonight is when the new list drops. Japan's meta has definitely shaped up into a very purple-dominated meta, and because of this, it's time to hand out some limits or bans to tone down the power creep. But the ultimate question I have is, will Bandai create a separate list between the English and Japanese releases? After all, they're already unveiling BT16, while we are just making our way into BT14. If the releases were tighter, and we were one step behind Japan, I think having one list is completely fine. But as it stands now, you risk alienating players who were excited to play something potentially new, as it was released in Japan. I know after seeing Promoware Garurumon get a limit, that I desperately wanted to have a cohesive Garurumon deck again. Two separate lists aside, this video aims to review over individual cards from previous sets. Some similar to Power and others that I'd love to see them limited. Keep in mind this is just my opinion, and while myself and other creators may have conjectures on what gets limited tonight, who knows? Bandai might have hyped the last 4 days, and will just limit one card again. And while Bandai typically does not hit super rare and higher cards, I'm going to break that rule after talking with other players from the other games, noting that One Piece has a restricted super rare in the form of Edward Newgate, and Dragon Ball Super has plenty of super rares that are also limited and banned. Starting with the starter decks 1 through 3 and BT1, these were the earliest products that Bandai released for Digimon, of which there are only 2 cards in mind that are long overdue for me for a restriction. Number 1. Starter Deck Greymon. This card has a generic +1 security check and has always been a problem in my mind, for the fact that you could in theory check 5 security in one turn with a War Greymon and have its protection, then Blitz Omnimon for game. While newer cards can counter this, I do think that with multiple printings and its accessibility, and with BT14 creeping around the corner, no more OTKs for Greymon. Put this to 1. Number 2. Gravity Crush. While there is an argument that this card is balanced, in that it has no security effect and there is a heavy toll to pay when it goes to your opponent's turn, after seeing Merva Cross abuse this, I think putting it to 1 is more than fair. After all, other decks that do utilize this card typically 1-tech it for the extra oomph for memory. BT2 offered the first black and purple cards, but after perusing through all of them, honestly there aren't any cards that stand out to the degree that I say limit it to 1 or ban it. BT3 has one offender that is long overdue. Hidden Potential Discovered is one card that can turn the tide of the game in your favor, whether it's checked in security or you draw it. Because for green decks, once they set up enough bodies in the case of Bloom Lordmon, Hidden Potential Discovered in a Quartzmon is a very toxic interaction. Personally, this card in my mind is similar to Mega Digimon Fusion, which is not exactly the same, but with certain decks that can bring out multiple bodies, this is the only card on my list that I'd love to see banned. Because then, maybe this will improve other option cards that Bandai can design for green instead of being limited by it. With BT4, if I touched Gravity Crush in BT1, you know I'm going to call out Blinding Ray. While cards have been abusive in the past with some decks, it was also again abused in the case of Merva Cross. While this card doesn't have a security effect and it causes you to lose security for 2 memory, a Merva Cross deck can combo off with 10 or 12 memory in a turn, with multiple copies drawn via Shoutmon Cross 4 or triggering each Ikari Hinamoto. With Ultimate Cups limiting Cerberusmon Werewolf mode, this is another card that is a possible restriction. The problem with Werewolf mode is that with more and more purple revive cards, it does become a problem for future design if you have ways to spam multiple of these Digimon out. Despite Calling of Darkness to 1, there are more and more cards that can also retrieve from trash as well. And finally, Thomas H. Norstein. This tamer has a main effect that lets you unsuspend your Digimon with Gao in its name, if your opponent has 8 or more cards in hand. Again, while Mirage may not be powerful now, training option cards will definitely give it a boost. BT5 was probably one of the most fun sets for Digimon. After reviewing over all the cards, there isn't a single card that I feel needs to be limited or banned at this time. It was just that fun of a set. But with BT6, this was the Gabubon format. And while Ice Wall has already been handled with so much trashing in future purple decks, I can't help but wonder if Underworld's Call should be limited to 1. In the current English meta, this card hasn't been abusive, and in Japan, the main problem isn't even the option card, it's the Garurumon engine. This card is probably on my lowest of the low in being hit, but there are some cards I definitely want to be limited, or even banned. But besides this option card, Tsunomon may be another potential contender for limitation, due to its ability to draw if a card is trashed by card effect. Still, this would be preemptive for our English meta, as this card isn't crazy, at least not yet. Moving to BT7, Eismon's Scatter Mode is the only card here that might see a potential limit. In combination with BT2 Gabumon, this Digimon can in essence draw 5 and pitch 3. While Eismon was already limited, limiting this would only further limit the entire package. Design-wise, this card requires that your Digimon be deleted, and we know that a handful of us are unlucky, or maybe lucky, that our Eismon Scatter Mode jams for several turns. BT8 introduced a lot of new cards, from keywords like Armor Purge and even the start of deleting Tamers. What all should be limited here? I combed through the cards and found only one card that kind of annoyed me, and that is Orumon. Orumon by itself isn't necessarily a problem, but with cards from BT13 can enable easy recycling of Orumon, it quickly becomes a problem that continues unsuspending and adding more attacks. Granted, Alphamon isn't a top dog right now, but I also feel certain cards will continue limiting how the archetype is designed. One reason why this card wouldn't be limited here is because Bandai tends to hit only cards that are common, uncommon, rare, and promo. And until now there hasn't been a card that's super rare or higher that was ruining the game. But let's keep looking at my other picks, shall we? BT9 further exhibits this with the X-antibody archetype. One problem I have is with OTKs. And the thing is, should Bandai continue leaving some decks unchecked with either protection or general extenders? As a result, I have selected 2 cards here that I could see being limited to 1. Metal Greymon X is a Digimon that can add DP and another security check. In the presence of Raid War Greymon and Piercing Metal Greymon, you have literally ways to potentially OTK your opponent, while also keeping protection. Likewise, where Garurumon X can unsuspend itself mid-battle and keep battle protection through inheritables. And frankly, enough is enough. BT10 was a newer set that I honestly don't have a problem with. Bandai has largely fixed this one already with its restriction to Cross 4. And I don't think anything else needs to go, especially if you're limiting Gravity Crush and or Blinding Ray. BT11 is another set that in some people's mind has a lot of problem cards. You might think Mirage Galgamon is problematic for Mirage Burst Mode decks. You might think Vmon or someone in the line to Ulforce is also a problem. However, none of these cards have kept pace with the newest cards in Japan. As a result, Mervamon is on some people's thoughts for being limited to 1. Again, this card is a super rare for potential limit. But generally speaking, I don't think Bandai has considered the outcomes and interactions of newer cards with older cards. Mervamon continues seeing new members with retaliation with each set. And because Anubismon gets major power creep, she gets even better. BT12 has 2 cards in particular I'd like to discuss: Marcus Damon and Tai Kamiya. Tai Kamiya is one of those cards that isn't too far-fetched, but also adds value and defensive options to Greymon decks. Limiting it to 1 would also force players to go back to an inheritable blocker versus getting it, or plus 1000 DP on a whim as its hit in security. But Marcus Damon's the real offender in my mind, because of its ability to circumvent the memory system. While limiting it to 1 would really slow down Shinegreymon, there is an alternative to slowing this deck down, which I'll cover in my final thoughts. But if not Shinegreymon, BT13 GeoGreymon is yet another offender. To make things worse, this card is so generic that because of its vaccine trait, that BT14 Patamon can digivolve into this from security for free. Place a yellow Digimon from hand into security, then resolve GeoGreymon's effect to play a Tamer from security. If that Tamer was TK Takashi, go ahead and nab back that yellow Digimon you just put in and recover 1. As much as I want to do this combo, I can see how GeoGreymon can be very beneficial for other yellow Tamer heavy decks. Although I was thinking about making a segment on salty picks, talking about Hades, Force, or Deathslinger isn't really the right call for a limit or restriction. Yes, these cards do suck sometimes, but that's also why there's evade and protection from destruction for certain archetypes. But out of all the cards that I've covered today, I don't expect Bandai to hit more than 4 of these cards. Because after giving a 4-day wait period and giving us just one restriction in the form of Greymon X, I honestly could see hits that don't affect our English meta until much later down the line. Realistically, Ultimate Cups provide insight on what Bandai is looking at in terms of restrictions. With that in mind, Hidden Potential Discovered to 0, Marcus Daemon to 1, Cerberusmon Werewolf Mode to 1, and Garurumon X to 1 would be my top choices. However, the last thing to discuss would be training option cards. While yes, these cards can effectively make most jank decks more consistent, the slippery slope becomes that your already consistent decks become overtuned. One argument I've seen being floated on discussions is limiting the training option cards to 1, but if you were to limit Marcus and Thomas to 1, I think you could keep these training cards at 4 and limit other problem cards in the future. What are your thoughts? And which takes do you agree with, disagree with, and why? Let me know in the comments as the clock ticks down on when we find out what will be limited, or even banned. This is DIGI-PANDA, logging out.